rural inhabitants on the same terms as urban men had been reformed. And that was the most dramatic growth in the electorate until 1918, when all men and some women get the vote. Still, as a percentage of the population, so on this side you have the size of the electorate, and this is the percentage of the total population. Still, you can see even in 1884, the size of the total population is only 30%. Okay, so still of the adult population. So still, very few people are really participating in this electoral process. The other key element that 1832 does, for the first time, is redistribute seats. Okay, this is what we call redistricting. Okay, there's a massive amount of redistribution, and the point was basically to get rid of all the old rotten boroughs for sure, but also to try and enfranchise many of the new industrial cities in the north that didn't have any MP at all because they'd all grown up so recently. So 44 new seats are created in the industrial north. And to offset this, okay, and what they do is also create 66 new county seats. Okay, so this is a delicate balancing act. You don't want to go and enfranchise, the urban bourgeoisie and without offsetting that by creating more rural seats that were thought to be more easily controlled by the landed aristocracy. So 1832 is often presented as a great radical step, but actually in many ways it serves to sort of entrench the power of the landed aristocracy. The other thing about redistricting or redistribution was the attempt to try and create some type of balance between constituencies of very, very different sizes. Okay, so that one vote in one place wasn't worth considerably less than in another. So what they do was create lots of double member constituencies, where constituencies return 2 MPs to Parliament. So in 1832, there are 240 out of 401 seats, MPs that come, constituencies return to MPs. There were still, however, 35 constituencies with less than 300 voters. Okay, less than 300 voters. Okay? And they're still returning a member to Parliament. Compare that to Liverpool, not my favourite city, but nonetheless, compare that to Liverpool with a population of 11,000 that just gets 1 MP. Okay, so clearly an enormous discrepancies existed. The last point that I want to make about these initial set of reforms in 1832 was that one of the consequences of them was an intensification of political conflict, of elections. Okay, I said that basically about 65% of elections went uncontested in the 18th century. Between 1832 and 1867, that fell to 50%. So just about half of the constituencies were holding elections. And then after 1868, that falls to, that rises to, falls to 30%. So 70% of constituencies are now holding elections all the time. And that continues to rise until 1918, where they're compelled, legally compelled to hold an election. Similarly, the length of parliaments declined. Okay, so in the 1832, each parliament was to last for 7 years. Okay, so you could confidently expect to be an MP as long as you didn't drop dead, like the man in the Blackadder clip. You could confidently expect to be there for 7 years. In 1867, that was reduced to 5 years. So there were elections more frequently as a consequence of the reduction of the term of a parliament. Now, I think probably this is the most important part of the entire lecture, Okay, so if you're asleep, wake up. Because if you don't get this bit, you really won't get the lecture at all. Because I think the most important element of the entire process of electoral reform and of trying to create a new version of democracy was the reform of what became known as corrupt practices. I said that in the unreformed system, it seemed perfectly legitimate for people to sell their votes and for non-voters to have an influence over those who cast their vote. What these reforms tried to do, what the reforms against corrupt practices in 1853 and 1883 tried to do, was to ensure that the voter could act as an individual and not have to answer or be held accountable to anyone, that they were beyond influence and that they could act independently, that they were a rational individual who could make their own decisions free of any interest or influence upon them. This was the quintessential idea of being a liberal citizen, that you were free to cast your vote as you saw fit, and that that vote was now attached solely to you as an individual. You didn't have to explain, you didn't have to account for it in any way to anyone else. Now, I won't go through all of the various things that the Corrupt Practices Act did, because that's available for you online, that very handy and readable document. It's also on the handout that I've given you. What I want to dwell on instead is the introduction of the secret ballot in 1872. Now, various experiments had been held at the level of local government, for instance in the election of poor law guardians after 1834, with the distribution of ballot cards to people's houses. So that instead of having a central place of gathering that was often violent and unruly, what you would do is go and hand out ballot cards to people who had the vote and then go around and collect them up a few days later. Okay? And that was meant to be an attempt both to disperse the unruly nature of an electoral crowd, but also give people the privacy to be able to vote in their own homes. It didn't, obviously, take into account that many of the people that were voting may have been illiterate and couldn't read a ballot card. Okay? So therefore, they often had to have the ballot cards read to them or have someone else fill them out on their behalf. Now, there is no agitation for a secret ballot. There is no agitation for the reform of corrupt practices. Okay? There is, but it's so infinitesimally small as to be not worth any attention at all, which is why I'm not giving it any, apart from that brief mention. Okay? These reforms are entirely coming from people who have a vision of what a liberal political democratic system should be and want to enshrine it. And so in 1872, what the secret ballot does is allow people to vote in precisely these types of conditions that you see behind me. Anonymously, as an individual, free of any exterior influence or interest. And, more important, just as importantly, in a deliberate, orderly fashion. All the hullabaloo that surrounded the hustings and the gathering of the community around them eradicated. Okay? So politics suddenly, the electoral process suddenly becomes more orderly, more deliberate, more individuated. Very, very, very important. Now, one qualification that I want to make to that, okay? If I'm talking about a new type of political subject coming into being, this idea of a liberal individual acting in their own conscience and no one else, there were also contradictory trends that went on. Okay? And the Redistribution Act of 1885 is a great example of a counter trend. That is to say that what the Redistribution Act of 1885 does is it doesn't get rid of double member constituencies. What reformers wanted was to get all constituencies down to voting one candidate and to have constituencies all of the same size. And the 1885 Act was a complete fudge where that didn't happen. You still had constituencies of widely different sizes, and you still had double member constituencies. And the reason why they kept it was because they thought that these constituencies, these huge constituencies, represented something that historically resembled a community that had to be kept together. It couldn't be abstractly divided into different districts, that they had to create, they had to maintain, if you like, the organic unity of an original community. The other point in which this idea of a corporate as opposed to an individual political subject lives on is actually in 1918, when they enfranchise people by group. It's no longer just by how much property you have as an individual. In 1918, they changed the rules entirely. And they say, okay, certain groups are going to be allowed in and others aren't. Okay, so the people that aren't are the conscientious objectors. Anyone who refused to fight in the First World War has their vote taken away from them as a group. People who are included as a group are women who have been engaged in types of military service during the war. Okay? So a very, very different blueprint is used in 1918. And then the third and final example is the very bizarre thing of the university and business franchise, okay, which had existed from 1832 and continued to exist right down to 1948. Anyone know what the university franchise was as we're in a university? Yeah, that's exactly it. If you had attended one of the specified universities, I've just covered myself with water, and not all universities had returned a member, but certain, basically the ancient ones did. You got to vote twice, as a member of the university and as a resident in the constituency that you lived in. And you were given that double vote because it was thought, like all of you before me, that you were the perfect type of liberal political subject. Highly educated, highly intelligent, highly deliberate in action when it comes to casting your vote. So therefore you were worth having a second vote. Similarly, the business franchise, you obviously don't need that to be explained. You're given it because business was thought to be an important constituency. If you owned a business in one area and you lived in another, you got 2 votes for the location of your business and the location of your residence. So there were different models, but basically the point that I'm trying to say is that these reforms in the 19th century sanitize the electoral process. They reduce it down to voting as an individual act and make it free of the politics of influence and interest that had once seemed legitimate. Whew. Sorry, I did write a whole book about that one, so I can get carried away, and I did a little bit there. But does anyone have any questions before I talk about then what political parties do when they come into this new system? Yeah. I'm not sure what you're getting at. In the House of Lords? Yeah. Bishops were appointed to the House of Lords, the aristocracy and the bishops of the Anglican Church. Any questions about the reforming process? The old system, the new one? Yeah? Your name?
Nicole.
Nicole.
About the unreformed system, I just want to clarify.
The what system? The unreformed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're plumping the vote, that means you're casting 2 votes for one person?
One. When you plump, you choose one, not 2 candidates. Has anyone come across this phrase of plumping? If you plump for something? Yeah? Yeah. The poll book. No. No. Sometimes you